Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Martha. Thank you to the whole community of Waimea. That was 30 years ago, to be exact, 1993, when I came down here. Oh, there's Nancy McMahon back there who just sort of walked in too. So Nancy was state archaeologist for Kauai at the time, and Martha was state parks archaeologist. And so I never imagined 30 years ago when I started this dissertation project that I'd be standing here 3 decades later and giving a talk to Waimea community people about this site still. But it has many layers. It's not something that you can just sort of look at once and say, okay, here's the truth, and walk away. There's a lot of mana in this place. And I think that that's sort of what was missed with the way that it was being maintained and kept in terms of what people knew about it. I can remember my first time coming in, I'd been at the Bishop Museum the year before, but I mainly thought I was going to Berkeley to do archaeology of Russian America in Alaska. I'd been working in Alaska as an Alaskan archaeologist, but I met a professor at Berkeley named Patrick Kirch, who is another incredibly well-known guy for the Pacific, and I realized how knowledgeable he was. And since I was still in my 20s when I got there, just still in my 20s when I got to Berkeley, I wasn't good on committing to anything, and I tried to find a way to avoid commitment. So I picked Kirch, and I picked my Alaska advisor, and I put them together, and light bulb went off. So I was like, there's one of these Russian sites in the Hawaiian Islands, and so I came back here. But the more I looked at it, the more it was obvious that this isn't a Russian site, and I've spent the last 30 years saying this isn't a Russian fort, it's a Hawaiian fort. And I've been teaching since I finished my PhD was 96. I got hired at UH Hilo. The year after that, I've raised a daughter on Laupohoihoi, Big Island. My wife, and I've been here for 30 years now, and I really appreciate the chance that community members have made for me to constantly come back and forth and to see the long-term effects of to do something and to know that basically it has had some impact on community is a wonderful feeling. And yeah, I'll stop there. But I'm not done with my talk, but I'm going to go back to the mic and we're going to start talking. So I've talked about the book, which is called Hawaii's Russian Adventure, so many times. I don't want to come back and give that talk again. And what I want to do is talk about some new things that I've been working on since the book came out. That was 2002. The book was 20 years ago, right? Or 21 years ago. And so there are new things that have turned up, and I want to talk a little bit more about those. And what Maureen asked for, and I really agree, is that last talk I gave was more about trying to make this place come alive and sense like what was going on. How was this site, this big pile of rock that's still covered in Kaahale back there, how was that part of a community? Because right now it seems pretty isolated, right? Waimea Town's over there, Hanapepe's over there, and there's this big pile of rock and nobody's living close to it. So it sort of feels like an isolated thing. You're going to understand why that wasn't the case and how landscapes change over time, okay? Here we go. Hey, am I good over here? No, not good. Sound guy? Ed, okay, turn it on. There it is. Oh, hey, I found an on switch.
There you go.
Hello? Yeah, okay, here we are. Okay, so, and you're going to kill that one, right? Okay,
Exactly.
all good. So, what I want to start with here is putting this place back in a cultural landscape and not isolated by itself, as I was saying. And you can't see that anymore, but believe me, it wasn't by itself. It was never by itself, sort of sitting out here. And I think the idea that it was sort of this isolated fort on a promontory by itself is one thing that helped keep that myth of it being a Russian fort alive. In other words, like Russians showed up, they built a fort out here on a promontory, like over the bay, and then they left. And now it's in ruins, right? That's sort of what most people seem to understand about this place. So I don't know if the visuals are going to do this at this sort of talk because they're so light, but one of the things that I do always mention that I have to mention here again is that we have drawings of this exact spot from 1778 when Captain Cook first came into this bay. There was a surgeon on board his vessel named William Ellis, and he drew 2 watercolors. One's in Australia, one's at the Bishop Museum, that show this spot. And you can see, and this is going to sound like JFK, you can see the grassy knoll, right? That's out there. And there's not much on that grassy knoll at the time. But if you look at the west side of the Waimea River, and you can't probably see it from where you are, there's hundreds and hundreds of houses that he's drawn on there. But there's a little footnote on this, and that is on the east side, where I've got a little red arrow pointing on one of those drawings. there is a cluster of houses, and they're relatively big compared to the ones on the west side of the Waimea River. And I'm zooming in just a little bit tighter, and maybe that's just enough. If you want to take a chance to come up and peek closer, go ahead, do that. I don't mind. I don't need you to all sit in your chairs. I teach at a university and people wander all over. But you can see that basically there's about 15, 20 sorts of houses penciled in along the coast with the big peaks on them at that spot. And that is what we know from other records after Captain Cook left, but from getting into the 1790s and 1780s, various people came into Waimea and met Kaeokulani, who was Kaumuali'i's father, living on the east bank of the Waimea River and describing the spot that's so many rods sort of over the river itself and along the shoreline. So I have always thought that what is drawn on William Ellis's map there is basically a kauhale for Ali'i Nui. And the separation is Makainana on the west bank, east bank is for the Ali'i, right? And if you look at that grassy knoll, empty of anything at all, that's pretty weird when you have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people living on this island. You have the Waimea River coming down from Waimea Canyon, and this is what we would call in today's day and age prime real estate, right? Freshwater, kula lands, right here by the river, all the kalo that you could possibly grow within walking distance, and there's almost no houses. That's an artificial kind of emptiness. Do you understand, right? And I think that what we're looking at here is a kapu landscape on which Kaeokulani was living himself on the east bank. There are lots of other things that turned up that are in this book that you can read. Again, it's been out 21 years, and I don't want to spend all this time reciting a 21-year-old book, but lots of things show that that's the case. So 1810 is another sort of important date, which we'll start talking about in a little bit, because that's when most history books will tell you that Kaumuali'i sort of made himself subordinate to Kamehameha, and the Hawaiian Islands were finally united in one kingdom. End of story. And really what I ended up finding, which was the first big sort of surprise, was back at the Mass Historical Society in Boston. I found a ledger called the Log of the Atahualpa that was written in 1814, and that was a American trading vessel who had and the Russians were about to buy it, and all the crew took all of their goods off of the Atahualpa and they stored them right here in Waimea. And so I've got a journal that covers the entire year of 1814, which is before the Russian thing ever began, right? So that talks about all the daily life going on in this community in the year 1814. It is awesome. And it's awesome because of the little things, not these huge big events. Well, the big events are also awesome too. But what I've got up here on the screen, I'll see if I can read it on my own screen right here. So February 7th, 1814. The natives hauled the scene like a big, you guys know what hukilau is, right? The sort of thing, like big fish nets. They hauled the seine and caught about 50 fish of different kinds. They did that on February 7th, and then on March 8th, they did it again, and they caught 5,000 fish of different kinds. So that's a big haul, right? They did it again on May 11th, and they caught 1,200 fish of different kinds. And I love picturing this sort of seasonal activity of the people in Waimea coming together and working together with this big net that they have in order to haul the fish out of the mouth of the Waimea River. It's such a statement of community engagement and sort of working together. And I love that image of life in Waimea in 1814, before any of this Russian stuff began. And at this time, you've got Kaumuali'i and these Americans sort of living together I think on this east bank of the river for the most part. Some of it might have been on the other bank. But there's all sorts of things politically that are going on in the year 1814. So one is that because all these Americans are here, Kaumuali'i decided that he was going to stop sending any of that ho'okupu, any of that tribute, back over to Kamehameha on the other island. This is 1814, again, before the Russians ever show up. He says, nope, not doing that anymore. I've got American cannons, I've got American support, I've got American black powder, and I am reestablishing my sovereignty to make certain that this is my kingdom and not just something underneath Kamehameha. That's not in any other history book than what I think I've wrote so far. And that's been out for 20 years. It's like, it's an uncomfortable truth that people don't want to find, but it's in a log, and there it is. Here is this thing being said that the islands are not actually fully united. I published that in Hawaiian Journal of History, I think in 1996, and I think it's been cited 3 times since 1996. But that's part of history that must be uncomfortable to everybody else because no one else wants to bring it up. But there it is. So that happened, and when that happened, it says that Kamoli built a flagstaff outside of his halle and raised an American flag on that flagstaff. There's a flagstaff inside this fort right here, and I often wonder if that flagstaff predates the walls of the fort itself. Do you understand? Right. So these are all different ways to picture this place, sort of slowly changing over time. So that flagstaff goes up on February 8th. On March 18th, the journal entry is the one that I had sort of knocked my socks off. Says Kamoli no longer is sending tribute to Kamehameha I, and they were making every preparation to protect this island from his imminent invasion. And so that's March 18th of 1814. A couple months later, May 31st, Kamoli is building his own stone storehouse there. So there's a stone house that is being put up to sort of store his stuff in, which is a different kind of architecture. So slowly, the nature of the community landscape is changing to these sorts of alliances that Kamoli is forming with Americans at this point. On April 1st, which is just 2 days later, Kamoli holds a council of war about the impending Kamehameha I invasion, and on the next day, they take 17 ali'i who have ties to Kamehameha I and send them back to Oahu so that they're not going to be here and causing trouble anymore. So this is all sort of powerful parts of a timeline that show a political rift that has nothing to do with Russians. Russians aren't even on anybody's radar yet at this point. So on April 13th, which is just another 11 days later, there's a public exhibition of what is called in the journal the Pooh gods. I'm pretty certain that he's saying Ku, but he's an American and he doesn't know how to spell, right? And so that's the Ku gods that are going out over which Kamoli presided, right? So that's April 13th. September 15th, skipping ahead a little bit more, there's a human sacrifice that took place at night that's going on, and there's a lot of political shenanigans that are underway at this time as different people are sort of vying for to try to figure out how to move things forward. But it sounds like a difficult end to the year. And towards the end of the year, the War of 1812 is ending, and the Americans are leaving. And the Americans leave Kauai on October 1st and take off for Canton, which leaves Kamoli without any of that Western munitions and all sort of on his own. That was October 1st. And then you go October, November, December, January, February 1. So like just basically 3 months is when now the Russian vessel bearing in a storm is pushed ashore right outside of Kamoli's own residential compound, dropping off cannons, gunpowder, munitions, and everything that he sort of needed. By the end of that year, that was the very beginning of 1815. By the end of the year, the Russian American company sends Schaefer down here to negotiate for the return of that material, and instead Schaefer finds himself in an alliance with Kamoli to protect this island from Kamehameha. And so all of that's I think one of the biggest political turn of events that people don't get from most of the histories that people read, because everyone says that Schaefer showed up here and convinced Kamoli'i to sign this alliance with him. Kamoli'i had his own agenda that he had established long before that. And again, it's hard to find that published anywhere still, but I'll say it till the day I die, because these journals are pretty straightforward in terms of what they're saying, and they're not fakes, they're real journals and they're out there, right? So all of that stuff sets up the arrival of the Russians, and I think you can picture a community here. Lots of other things in the documents at this time that say that Kamoli is an adored ali'i by the people of Kauai. He is someone who is loved for his leadership and his common sense and his diplomacy, and that he was, as Maureen says too, largely a man of peace. But he's trying to keep his peace by not being overrun by another ali'i that's coming in from another island. Yeah. So into this, now this fortification is built right here. You know, when you picture that Kamoli'i's own kauhale, he took over Ka'eokulani's kauhale, is right here outside of the walls. So basically this fort with all these cannons that you see was pointed right at his kauhale. Who do you think has the keys to that fort? Is it some new Russian guy who showed up, or is it Kamoli'i? Right? The Russians certainly supplied the designs for what the fort looked like. But I think one of the key points that I'm trying to make to my students and to you guys is it's very hard for our minds to accept that this could be a Hawaiian thing, because it doesn't look like anything that we've seen that's Hawaiian before. And because it doesn't look Hawaiian, our minds are very willing to accept that it must have been Russians who built it and Russians who occupied it. Hawaiians built this, Hawaiians occupied it. Schaefer and the Russian American company largely stayed up in Princeville, and they didn't live in this fort for one single day. when it was that Komolyi decided that these Russians really weren't going to help him out, which didn't take it took less than a year. It was May of 1817. He basically said, "Yep, you guys got to go." And Philip Osipov, who was one of the people with the Russians at the time, in the Russian documents themselves, say they, meaning Hawaiians, not they, the Russians, because he was one of that crowd. They, Hawaiians, started the fortress, which is almost complete on the seaside, but not yet finished on the other sides. And so basically, by the time that the Russian-American Company and Russians had gone, you had the Starlight projections facing on the Mackay side. You had the Flagstaff, which is also recorded as still being there, and you had something that they called the magazine, which is a big central sort of building in the middle. And that's all that was there. And again, it was never the Russians, but that's all that was completed by May of 1817. The drawing that you're looking at was done by a Russian colleague, Alexander Molodin, who was an architectural historian out of Novosibirsk in Russia, and he showed up, and the first drawing, I'll show it to you, didn't look anything like this at all. It looked like a Russian fort straight out of Russia, and it took a couple of years of working together. Martha knows this whole story very well, to try to slowly get him to sort of redraft these things to look more like what we know that they looked like. And you can't see it from where you're sitting, I guarantee you, but he's actually drawn on Komolyi's kauhale outside the fort walls, but they're all so small that they could be like pup tents. You know, you can't even see them. He's done it to make it look like the fort is by itself, like the Russians had built a fort in the middle of nowhere. And after more finagling with him, I got him to basically draw it bigger and draw it like so that you can actually see the kauhale out there. So, and if I want to show you one more thing, you can see a couple of houses on the west bank. Can you see them there? You can see those houses fine. But the ones on the east bank outside the fort, can't see them at all because they're tiny little blips, right? And so, but by I got them to basically increase the size and basically so they can be visible. And so when Komolyi was living there from 1817 up to 1821, that's basically where he was living. And if you understand anything about explosions and projectiles, you wouldn't want your house there if somebody else had their hands on those cannons, right? The whole structure of this place says this is Komolyi's fort and not ever a Russian fort, but somehow we've missed that through history. Somehow we've let that sort of fade into some politically correct story, and we're still running into people like, oh, it's a Russian fort. It was a Russian fort. Why did anybody change the name to Pa'ula'ula? It's like, well, there are reasons. Komolyi leaves in 1821. He spends his last 3 years mostly on Oahu. He did come back with Ka'ahumanu over here in the year after he went over there. But after a battle in 1824, the fort again changed, and you have apparently the Komolyi's kauhale, which had in fact another part of it was a 10-foot tall semicircular stone wall that surrounded the kauhale. It was different from the fort wall. But by after 1824, it seems that was completely dismantled, and we have soldiers that are more loyal to the Kamehameha lineage, who are. Can I stand here? I'll stand right there. Okay, good. So you have, and it looks like the Royal Kauhale is completely dismantled, and now the soldiers who were stationed at the fort are living outside the fort walls and farming their own kula, or sort of sweet potato in sort of upland, sort of dryland ag fields. And so that gets up to 1824. We start to have lots more records that I'll start talking about, and then our first map shows up in 1885, and the map was done by a Hawaiian government surveyor, and that map, at least one version, you can still see that old settlement outside the fort walls on the 1885 map. The ones in black on this map, the filled-in ones, are actually probably lived in 1885, but the ones in white are abandoned buildings. And so you can see some of them are white squares and others are black squares. I say you can see as if you, back there, the Rossis can see them, and I know you're like, yeah, I'll take your word for it. But anyway, that's that. So all of this is in Hawaii's Russian Adventure, and like I said, you can read it, but for those of you who don't know this story, I wanted to give that much about the reasons why it should be called by its Hawaiian name. And in the 1840s, we have a written version of the Hawaiian name, which is Papu, which stands for fort, and then after that is the word Pa'ula'ula. And so that shows up in Mahele documents from the 1840s, from some of the people who were stationed here, the soldiers who were stationed here, and that was their name for the place. And Auntie Olitha Ke'ohi, who can't be here tonight, that is the name that she learned from her father as far as the name of this place as well. So we have oral tradition and written Hawaiian history that both give the name Pa'ula'ula for this place. And that's the justification for why the name's changing. Right. So all the time that I was doing this, I was also getting into a little bit of the seaman side of things in maritime history. I was looking at all these boats and vessels that are going around in different places, and just last year I published a new book called Connecting the Kingdom. And there's a lot more information on Kaumoli'i in here than was in Hawaii's Russian Adventure, and that's sort of what Maureen wanted me to mostly focus on, which I will. And I'm going to tell you a few stories that are hopefully going to make this place come a little bit more to life. But just like with the fort, looking like a Russian fort, but really being a Hawaiian fort, I think that there is a double standard that we carry in our society, and that is that indigenous people are not allowed to acquire foreign things without eroding their own culture, right? That if you take in something, it's like a poison that erodes your own culture, and you forget who you are, and you forget your identity. See these guys right here? One of them is sort of the overall wearing Iowa corn farmer, right? And the other one is a tobacco farmer in Virginia. I think they represent the truest form of American, right? You know, that farmer out there on the fields. But what are they growing? Indigenous crops. Corn, you know, came out of South and Mesoamerica, and tobacco is also, again, an indigenous American crop. And no one's saying that they have eroded their cultures and their traditions because they've chosen to acquire something that they felt was useful to them. I think we need to give that same kind of self-determination not only to the Hawaiians of the 19th century, but the Hawaiians of today, right? Do you understand what this is? It's about self-determination. And if you choose to acquire something to strengthen your own society and your own community, you should not be denigrated for that, for sort of giving up on your past and your culture. Because we don't do it to Western culture, so why do we do that to indigenous culture? You know, pretty much. Okay, there's a clap there. All right. So that definitely happened with the Ali'i, and ships, Western-style ships, were very important to them. It wasn't because they didn't have their own voyaging traditions. You know, Hawaiian voyaging canoes and Hawaiian canoes just to get between islands and for fishing are incredible craft for what they do. But they're not built to carry huge cargo, and they're not built to carry cannons, and they're not built to carry lots of other things that Western vessels can do, and lots of people between islands. So you have Kamehameha that's acquiring the Fair American in 1790, and that's sort of held up as an example of this Western acquisition, where basically Koa, soldiers loyal to Kamehameha, killed everybody aboard this small Western vessel, and then kept the vessel for themselves, and then used it in their battles as they were heading between the islands. And that's sort of what most people picture when you hear about Western vessels being used by Hawaiian people. And if you hear about others, like one called Cleopatra's Barge, I like to use the metaphor of Hummers parked in suburban driveways, right? It's the idea that it's something that's completely useless, that's overwrought, that you don't need, where you're wasting your money. And that's basically what's going on. I want to give you a different narrative, and it's just like the fort. In other words, the fort was very useful to Kaumoli'i, and ships were also very useful to Kaumoli'i and his successors. George Langsdorff in 1804 was writing at, okay, I think I'm going to be able to do this. And this is talking about Kamehameha in 1804. What held the king's attention more than any other subject, though, is shipbuilding. Already it is said he can accurately and with discernment spot the strengths and weaknesses in a ship's construction. All equipment and tools relating to shipbuilding, he regards as particularly valuable. There we go. I'll learn to speak in a solid, fluid sentence soon. Okay. One cannot do better, therefore, than to use such tools as articles of trade when going to Hawaii. Any sailor who is at the same time a ship's carpenter is particularly welcome there, and is straightway presented with a piece of land and almost anything else that he may want, right? So you could leave as a ship's carpenter, which isn't super high status in New England, and you could come out here and live the life of royalty, right? And believe me, ship's carpenters chose to do that, right? And you have this sort of gathering of all of these different sort of new kinds of craft specialists, like ship's carpenters settling in with Kaumoli'i and with Kamehameha. And we have one account that Kaumoli'i built himself a brig on this island in the early 1800s with a foreign ship's carpenter helping him do it out of local woods. So it's not just stealing foreign ships and not knowing how to build them. They wanted to know how to make their own with the resources that were here. After they had these, here's what Kamehameha said when he was writing to King George III in England. He said, "I have built a few small vessels with an intent to trade on the northwest of America with taro root and produce that these islands of these islands for fur skins." So a lot of people think the word indigenous and capitalism do not belong in the same sentence, but they weren't speaking with Kamehameha, right? He was choosing to get deeply involved in this capitalist system around the world so that he wasn't at the bottom of it. I mean, granted, he couldn't change the overall situation of the spread of Westerners all around the world, but he wasn't going to be at the bottom of that ladder, and he realized how he could move himself up it by basically engaging straightforward with trying to do things that we associate with market economies and capitalism. How do we bring money into the nation as opposed to have it be a place where everything is exploited and taken out? You can go through the logs, and you will find that by 1794 there are at least 2 vessels that were out there that were in the that Vancouver writes about. And by 1798 there were 3 60-ton schooner on the stocks being built in Kealakekua Bay. In 1803, there were up to 20 of these vessels, some with copper bottoms, which was to protect from the worms that Kamehameha had built. These are not being stolen or bought. These are being built here. Do you understand the difference? Right. So it's a massive transformation of what's going on. And canoes are still being built as well. It's up to 25 in 1807, up to 30 in 1809, and up to 40 in 1811. And that's a lot of vessels that are being built in the Hawaiian Islands. So this is where it comes back to Kaumali'i and the way that Kaumali'i has been peripheralized. That's a great story about Kamehameha and how he is, to being very wise in his building up of a nation. Kaumali'i is doing the same thing over here as best as we can tell. And he's been written out of that story. And there's also a lot of sandalwood on this island. There's this guy named F.W. Howe, who's probably the most famous maritime historian of the Pacific. He was around in the 1930s, and he compiled a book that was called A List of Trading Vessels in the Maritime Fur Trade. And it came out in 3 separate pamphlets. And that was like my go-to Bible to try to find information on what vessels were out here and which ones the chiefs might have picked up, what the elite were using. And really what I found is I'd open them up and like, oh, here's the Lelia bird. And the last entry for it was later sold to Kamehameha. And then after that, there's another one that's the Columbia. Oh, last entry sold to Kamehameha for 400 piculs. Next one after that, the Forester. And it sold to Kamehameha and renamed the Ka'ahumanu. Right? And so it goes on and on and on with the last entry in Howie's book is always going to be sold to the chiefs, sold to the elite. And it's almost like the ships wreck on a reef. Like they don't even exist anymore once it is that the Hawaiians pick them up, right? So you go through all this stuff, and this is my favorite, and this is one of the things that goes straight back to Kaumali'i. By the time we get up to 1821, there's a vessel out here named the Beckett. The Beckett was built in New England. It was named after Retire Beckett, who was the most famous shipwright up there. He had built the Cleopatra's barge, which was the most expensive ship that had ever been built in New England. And so he was a top-notch artisan and shipwright. And the Beckett's sailing around out here, and Howie says that it got down here to Hawaii, and that she was reported as sold to the king there. He actually means Kaumali'i in this case, and I can give you the context for that if you want it. And then he says, this, however, was an error. Because she, again, they use the feminine name. She was trading on the coast, meaning the Pacific Northwest coast, like up in Alaska and Vancouver and British Columbia, trading on the coast in 1822 and 1823 in company with the Lascar, which was an American vessel. Both vessels were at Hawaiian Islands in 1823, and then in 1824, the Beckett left Honolulu bound for California, New Albion, right? And there, it seems, in 1825, the Beckett was again on the California coast, returning to the islands in November of 1825. This brig was still at Honolulu in January of 1826. There, she seems to have later been sold to Kaumali'i in 1826. I've got a pretty different kind of audience than what I normally talk to. What's the problem with Kaumali'i buying a vessel in 1826? He died in 1824. Okay, he can't buy a vessel in 1826 if he's been in the ground for 2 years over on Maui. And so this is the one snarky comment I have in the book, because Howie was not a Hawaiian historian. He didn't know these things, but basically Kaumali'i died in 1824. I have all of the bills of sale from the company he bought the vessel from in 1821, with the ship paid off in its entirety by the end of the year 1821. So when it's up on the Pacific Northwest coast, trading in 1823, 1824, and in California in 1825 and 1826, that's Kaumali'i's vessel that's up there doing that. What he did is he leased it out to American merchants who needed a vessel to go up there. He didn't go himself, and that's exactly what ship owners in Boston did, right? Most ship owners didn't get on their own vessels and sail around Cape Horn and come out to the Pacific. They gave them to other people, and they got some of the profits when they came back. That's exactly what Kaumoli'i was doing with his vessels. So the idea of sort of suburban Hummers, and these vessels just sort of sitting around here and being completely useless is a factor that is a product of the fact that people like F.W. Howe wrote these vessels out of Hawaiian hands, out of use once they were in Hawaiian hands, right? The Becket's the perfect example of that. So the Becket was right here too, lots of the time, right? I want you to picture Kaumoli'i with his own two-masted massive vessel out here in the Hawaiian Islands, right? This map's too small for you guys to see, but basically, if you can see some writing on there, those are places that vessels that were under Hawaiian ownership ended up around the Pacific in between 1790 and 1840. It's pretty much everywhere. It's, Valparaiso, Chile, Costa California, Petropavlovsk up in Kamchatka. So you have Hawaiian-owned vessels going to all of these different places. Again, just for a map sort of scale size, that's a 50-foot long double canoe that you see in the top left. And you can sort of see how much cargo that can carry. And the one that's the next largest is a 62-ton vessel, the Eos, which was purchased by Kaumoli'i in 1818. And then the Becket is the one that's underneath that, if you can sort of see the size of how large these vessels were, right? And the one down at the bottom is what's called Don Quixote, which at least the Western name for it was that, and then it became Kai Keopuolani, which was bought by Kamehameha III, and that's the largest one that I know of that the Hawaiian monarchy in the 1830s had picked up. So all of these stories basically start to make you realize that Hawaiian culture was not just living here trying to keep out the Western world. And another one of my favorite stories that has to do with that is that the missionaries arrived in a vessel called the Thaddeus in 1820. And that was bought by the Kamehameha line, and Liho sent it up to Kamchatka with a load of salt to trade up there, and they came back with lots of different things, but among the things they came back with were 2 caribou and 2 polar bears alive. So you can picture, and what I said, this is the sort of stuff that I love about, even though people think reading from books is dry, you start to get a different understanding of history when you can envision polar bears cruising around downtown Honolulu. It completely changes your mind about what this place was and what was going on. And that was Liho's choice. And in fact, Liho had asked for those polar bears. It wasn't just something he said, bring me back some of these bears, because I'd like to see those. I've heard about them, I want to see some. And so that stuff was coming back down here. So the image that you're looking at right now, again, awful for this light and for this screen, but it's in the book, and it shows all the different vessels that I could track names for between 1790 and 1840. There are 60 of them. The 4 in red are ones that I have names for that Kaumoli'i had. There was a 5th from the early 1800s that I have no name for. And so there were at least 5 vessels that Kaumoli'i had either built or he had purchased. And so you have, there are a whole bunch of stories to tell here. So one is that, and it's going to lead back to here. March 30th, you have, March 30th, 1821, Kaumoli'i purchases the Becket that we've been talking about for $34,000, right? In terms of like 3,400 piculs of sandalwood, which is, a picul is 133 pounds. That was a measurement of the day. It was March 30th, and then 2 months later, he buys another one that's called, in that day's writing, Tamahauralani, which is Kamaholelani. It's a vessel that's basically named after his Kalaimoku, another very famous ali'i from this island. And he purchases that vessel for 6,000 piculs. The Cleopatra's barge was 8,000 that Liho had purchased. So basically these two vessels combined were worth more than the Cleopatra's barge in terms of what he was spending, right? So that's May 31st, 1821. Some other things have changed in that time. One is that in the middle of the year before, Hume has shown up here with the missionaries, right, to live outside of this fort where we're at. Hume had been raised in New England. Kaumoli'i immediately wanted him to start being the one who negotiated with foreign traders because he understood Westerners better than other people did. He saw him as someone who would be good for that sort of role. The missionaries, the Whitneys and the Ruggles families both show up. They're given houses in Kaumoli'i's own Kauhale out here, and slowly they built bigger ones while they were here. And because those missionaries show up in 1820, that's when we start to have tons and tons of records of things that are going on in the Kauhale, even though many other things were going on before that we have no written records for. So one of my favorites, and I've used this before, but I just want to give it again because it's so powerful. It's 1821. You have this prudish Calvinist missionary, Mercy Whitney, who's out here saying, a few days since, Mr. Whitney and myself were going to the King's, which is a very short walk, a matter of rods, like, go outside of your house and walk 50 feet and you're at the King's place, right? When about halfway there, we were informed that the king and queen were at the hula hula native dance. Curiosity had many times prompted me to go and witness the scene of their diversions, but not being able to speak the language sufficiently to convince them of their folly, I had doubted the propriety of it. But being then so near the place, we concluded to go. Okay, Calvinist missionary, we're going to go watch a hula. Oh, okay, we'll do this. Okay, they were in a large yard on the bank of the sea, fenced off for that purpose. A great number were there, collected in several rows, formed consisting of men, women, and children. So it's not like the hula that we see at Mary Monarch, where it's all sort of kane or wahine. It's basically men, women, and children on a large. And so I like to picture that hula halal out here outside the fort walls. That does everything to sort of recontextualize what this place looks like, right? So that's basically January 1821, shortly after the missionaries got here. May of 1821, Kamali is learning to write from the missionaries, and he's just writing a letter over to some of his merchant friends on Oahu, saying, "I'm writing to you because I want some tin kettles. Please send them over. I'll pay for them. By the way, your wood will be ready in 3 months." And so you start to actually have these documents with missionary assistance, like basically sort of, and these I turned up again in sort of business files back in the Mass Historical Society. But it's really fun to see signed Tamarii and Queen Charlotte Kapule at the base of it, right? You can sort of see this, even though it's probably assisted writing, it's still another small moment of subtly changing life, right? No longer umeke, you got some tin kettles, I'd like to have those. And in they come, right? And I'll pay for them. Okay, for those of you who follow Hawaiian history, and if you haven't read what I've written recently, this will probably knock your socks off, but July 29th, 1821, you have Kamali's just finished purchasing all those incredibly expensive vessels. He's starting to talk to the missionaries about giving them a free ride on the Kamaholelani down to French Polynesia. And so where he's going to meet with Pomare II and do some national diplomacy sort of stuff, which is threatening to the Kamehameha lineage, both because he's over here spending so much money, and promising sandalwood for that, and because now he's going to go off and start doing international diplomacy with other cousins and brothers in French Polynesia. And so within basically just a couple months of that happening, over here on her own, comes over with a small entourage, comes Kahehe Malie, who is a widow of Kamehameha I. Later in her life, she goes by Hoapili Wahine. And I basically have an account of this, again, a missionary account of that. So soon afternoon, Kahehe Malie shows up with her attendants, landed just in front of the mission house, which is, again, right down between the fort and the sea which we're talking about, where the king and queen, with their attendants, met her, embraced and joined noses with loud crying, many tears, and other expressions of emotion. After some minutes, all sat down together on the sand for a considerable time, till the first bursts of feeling had subsided, when the king conducted his guests to the house, which he had prepared for their reception, by removing a quantity of imported goods lately purchased and spreading the best mats both in the house and in the court in front. Having ordered the slaughter of hogs, dogs, etc. for the purpose, he prepared a full repast for the company. At evening, he resigned his own dwelling to his guests. That's big for Ali'i, right? To say, okay, you can actually sleep in my hale, like as far as this, and I'll go somewhere else, right? Resigned for his guests, and retiring to another, sent out a crier to prohibit the common people from entering the enclosure, which is this 10-foot tall circular wall semicircular wall that's between the fort and sea. Where Kahehe Malie and her ladies and servants were lodged, and set a guard also at the gate. So you can sort of, I just think that the sense of sort of diplomacy and hospitality, which he was expressing for meeting this incredibly high-ranking Ali'i from another island, along with Deborah Kapule, is a pretty big moment. They had not met each other, as far as we can tell, at any point prior to this. And so here's the coming together of these two different families and the hosting of it. That was July 9th. Now what everybody has heard is that on July 21st, Liholiho crosses the channel, right? So Liholiho is now king. He's Kamehameha II. So this is just a couple weeks later. He gets on a small open schooner. It's not his big fancy vessel, Cleopatra's barge. It's a deckless sailboat. And he's got about 30 people with him, including Boki, Kapiolani, and her husband, Naihe, who's out there as well. They're all in this thing, and the way the story is told is that Liholiho was a little drunk and said, let's go to Kauai, and they cruise across this channel, and a big storm's out there, and they're having to bail. And when you're in an open sailboat with no deck, and the waves are breaking over it, if that thing gets swamped, you're not going to right it again, right? You know, if you're in a canoe, you can right it, and you can sort of keep on your way. So this is a much more dangerous thing to be in than a canoe as far as crossing that channel. And so, but he holds out his hand in front of him, and he doesn't hold it out like Nainoa Thompson does, but he sort of holds it out flat like this, and he goes, we're going to keep on going, and if you turn this thing around, I'm going to jump overboard and swim to Kauai, right? And so I'm sorry for doing the pigeon, but that's sort of how I hear it in my head, right? You know, and so and swim. So they keep on going, and they get in. It's sort of like before dawn on the next morning, but they come right into Waimea outside this fort. Kamui repeats that same hospitality, you know, greets them, sets out a feast, they meet. He offers his entire kingdom to Liholiho, and there's a long pause, and then Liholiho says, keep your kingdom, I'm here to sort of talk, and we will work as sort of friends. So they were working towards peace and diplomacy. This is all July 1821. The next day, July 22nd, Liliha, the wife of Boki, comes over herself in a small canoe with 4 paddlers. I love that part. It's like, you know, so you've got basically a huge number of the Kamehameha Ali'i being hosted at this place, you know, outside of the walls of this fort in the summer of 1821. That first arrival in July leads to over 2 months of holo holo around this island, where they're touring the whole island together and seeing the whole place. And I'm picturing the conversations which they're having. Oh, you know, Kamehameha I is dead. I forgot to leave. I left out one huge thing about Kahehe Malie. The next day, after they sort of did all that, they started making lei out of hala, right? And so the key, like the keys, and putting them together. And if you know the symbolism behind that, one of the things is it's about funerary rites. And with Kamehameha having died just 2 years before, they were basically mourning the death of Kamehameha. And it's also a symbol of new beginnings. And so, and if you go back to Kahehe Malie, I had in my photo here, did I get back to it? I'm sorry for going back and forth. Did I got the right one up? No, I don't. One more, right there. I think the one drawing we have of Kahehe Malie, she's also wearing a hala sort of kile around the outside, and you can sort of see it down there at the base. So these are poignant moments that are tied to this place. And so when I stand out there between the fort and the ocean and see all this broken up ground that's down there and kiawe trees, I can still sense this other thing because I've read the stories that are behind it. And I want this community to have that same chance. And so many people are helping to make that happen. It makes my heart very warm to see. But it's something that those stories, I think, are much more important than Russian fort, right? Okay, sorry for jumping around so much. So Liliha comes back over and joins that, sort of going around the whole island. And so that's July. And then September 16th, Kaumoli'i and Liholiho end up back here in Waimea. And Liholiho, by this point, Cleopatra's barge is over here, parked in the harbor. And Liholiho says, hey, come on board my vessel. And sure enough, the two Ali'i get on board that vessel, and it sails off for Oahu. And it's always been sort of presented as Kaumoli'i being kidnapped. And I think basically by this point, after 2 months of holo holo with this whole crew, with Kahehe Malie coming over and all the politics that they've been talking, the issue of marrying Ka'ahumanu had come up long before September 16th when he gets on that boat. I think he's fully aware that Ka'ahumanu wants to marry him. And I don't think he's that stoked about it, but I also think that he understands the consequence of a unification between these two different competing polities into one that would lead to peace, and that's keeping separate could lead to all sorts of difficulty in the future, which would lead to war and more bloodshed. And so in my mind, even though it is a taking of a beloved Ali'i from this island, I think the context argues very strongly that he was aware of what was happening and that he went over there. And to back that up, when Cleopatra's barge got to Waianae off of Oahu, the Kamaholeilani, Kamali'i's own vessel, had followed the Cleopatra's barge over to Oahu. And Kamali'i, on his own, gets back on his own vessel, whereas Liholiho sails off around the other side of the island. Kamali'i, on his own, sails into Honolulu, where he meets Ka'ahumanu and marries her. And so the idea that he's sort of in irons or chains being taken in, I think should be gone from history. I don't think that's how it happened. I think that basically there was some sense of resignation. And even though the loss of a beloved Ali'i on this island is a sad, sad thing, I think on some level, Kamali'i had become resigned to that. Other people can have other opinions. That's mine. Right? So what we're left with over here is Humehume. And other high-ranking Ali'i are still over here, and it's a little bit of, even though it might be it's good in the long run, it's certainly sort of threw the politics of Kauai into a state of discord for a while, and different things are going on. One of the sad things is that by February 9th, 1822, Kamali'i's own infant son, who had been sick for months and months, there were actually earlier reports of his son being sick, died on February 9th, and Mercy Whitney wrote in her journal that a regular procession of 2 and 2 followed the corpse going into the fort in which the grave was dug. Seems like entering a burying ground more than anything I witnessed since I left America. And so that's back in my 2002 book. It's not new information, but it's new to a lot of people who start to understand that this fort symbolically was something very different than a Western military fortification in the way that it was being used in that day and age as far as Hawaiian culture. That happens again in February. In March, Humehume has Boki's schooner, which is over here. Boki's another governor of Oahu. He's over here, and this schooner called the Young Thaddeus is over here. Boki says, hey, I want to take this out for sale. And he sort of bullies his way into getting that vessel and going for sale. And he says, then as a chief, he ordered his men to weigh anchor, and taking the helm himself, stood in towards the shore, like coming in right towards the river, right? And ran so near it as much to hazard the vessel, but fortunately ran clear and stood off again. Whew, relief. But not satisfied with one dangerous experiment, he returned, and holding the helm and commanding the vessel, ran it into the surf, still nearer to the shore. And the people on board remonstrated, and the people on shore entreated him to keep it farther off. But they were not regarded until he came in so near as to be unable to make a good retreat, and he ran the vessel aground, and it took almost a year to fix the thing after it happened, right? So Kamali'i is hearing these stories on Oahu. He knows that Humehume's son just died, and he might not be fully himself, but these were not the signs that he was looking for a leader on this island, you know, in terms of the recklessness of the whole thing. And those kinds of stories continue about Humehume. There was a guy named Captain Izakar Marsters who had become part of this community. He was one of the shipbuilders. He was one of the guys who was building local ships here. And so he was living right outside. This is a portrait of him from the Beverly Historical Society. And this is from John Coffin Jones, another American trader. Captain Marsters came up here last week. His dwelling houses have been destroyed by fire. And who do you think was the incendiary? No one less than Mr. George Tamari'i, which is Humehume. And merely because Captain Marsters denied him a bottle of gin. The amount of the property destroyed was $2,500, right? So this is basically Humehume, sort of the way he's at least being portrayed in the literature of the day, which is sort of losing that sense of a good leadership. We have the Battle of 1824, which is again all very much written about, and I don't want to go over that whole story again. I'm happy to answer questions on it if people want. And then the Kamehameha lineage takes over in 1824. The governorship, control of all of the different moku and ahupua'a, basically being taken over by people who aren't from Kauai, and a large-scale slaughter of people who lived here during that battle. It was not a battle that was sort of just a light thing. It was ugly war. And by the 1850s, we now have these Kamehameha lineage koa who are stationed around the fort, as I said, and we have their Land Commission Award testimony outside. And I think, even though I talked for a long time, there's so many more things I could say. These soldiers in the 1850, in the 2002 book, I've got names of over 2 or 3 dozen of these soldiers who are out there. And I know that there are people in this community today who are related to those people. And I'm betting that in the future, Maureen and I were just talking about this last night too, that there's so much more the community will be able to add to the story beyond what it is that I'm giving right now. When I wrote the book in 2002, I wrote it as a beginning, not as like, here's the expert PhD professor at UH Hilo. Keep in mind, I was 30, I was pretty young. I was pretty stoked about what I'd done, but at the same time, it was a beginning. And it's been wonderful to watch this unfold as years have gone by, to see the statue go up, to see reflections of what this place has slowly changed, and realize that there's so much more that can still be done in the future, and that this is not the end of the story, it's just the beginning. And I want to connect this, the important part is connecting this place back to community, and realizing that there are their own stories in this place. And I hope that that's what's going to happen as time goes on. And yeah, thanks very much.